To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are in episode 2 of season 8, and we're starting a new series that we just might not ever escape from. We're talking all about trapped horror.
All right, so I'm going to kick us off here and talk just a little bit about trapped horror, or I guess entrapment horror, however you want to look at it, just in general. And then I think we're probably going to take this episode, as we usually do at the first episode in a new series, to talk a little bit, not just about the type of horror, but also why it makes us scared, why it frightens us, and some of the history of it, if we could trace it down. I feel like it's kind of hard to trace the history of this in some ways because entrapment or being trapped, the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's just been a part of horror like forever. There's so many things that even when I think about it, have I read or whatever, anything that's trapped horror? And I think, no, I guess I haven't, because I'm thinking about what we think of it now. But then I realize it's kind of anytime you're isolated, there's an aspect of it, I guess you could say. So what we're thinking about here is a feeling of entrapment. So of course, I think everybody thinks immediately of claustrophobia. We don't like enclosed places, but I think it's also, when I was thinking about it earlier today, it's just the lack of agency or choice or feeling. So if you're trapped in like a house or something, or a mall or a store, or somebody's basement or whatever, it's not being able to just freely leave. If you've been invited to a home by Vincent Price and you can't get out until a certain time or something happens, then it's your inability to control your movement and your mobility. Also, some of the things that we threw in our group document for this was the idea that help isn't coming. Like, you can't necessarily think that someone is going to help you. You're prevented from calling for help in some way. And so that can lead not just to claustrophobia and a loss of freedom, but also a hopelessness. And I don't want to talk too much, I guess, more about it in general, other than I guess I could talk about like why I think it's scary. Um, I think all of those things I just mentioned are things that are, as human beings, we don't like dealing with. We don't like feeling trapped in our choices. We don't like feeling trapped in our lives. We don't like feeling trapped, by society. And we especially don't like feeling physically trapped in some way. One of the things that popped into my mind was how easy it can be to be trapped in things like we talked about Cujo with animal horror, and those people are just trapped in a car the whole time. And that kind of stuff is kind of scary because, especially that, I mean, you don't really think of an inability to leave a home or an inability to leave my car when I'm going somewhere, or an inability to leave anything. And as Lisa, I think you mentioned in the document, we now have the phenomenon of the escape room, which I wonder what the history is there. I don't know. But the idea of like almost making like a theme park idea of being trapped, but we know it's going to end in the end. And I think too, one of the movies that popped into my mind, I hope I'm remembering the title correctly, was a movie that we talked about, oh man, a couple years ago. I think it was The Endless, where the characters are trapped in some sort of weird spatial time loop. So I mean that works too as a way to be trapped as well. For me, I don't know. I don't know that I could say with certainty that I have claustrophobia per se, but feeling like if I was, thinking about like the fear that Victorians had, or 19th century people had, of like being prematurely buried, that is pretty creepy. Or one time I thought I was going to be stuck in an elevator with a bunch of people for a long period of time. It turned out being like 15 or 20 minutes, but it was enough that we started realizing that it could be a while. And that was kind of intimidating, though everybody seemed pretty friendly and I think we would have been okay. But yeah, I'm not necessarily a fan of like super cramped quarters. I think if I was crawling through tunnels underground, especially underground or being buried, the idea of all the earth over top of you and being afraid you couldn't fit into certain spaces, it would probably cause me to start having a panic attack or hyperventilate. It is something that I think is kind of uncomfortable for everyone. But of course, I mean, we have to say that there are people, this is like a special fear of theirs. Before I pass it on, I guess I'll talk just a tiny bit about what I was thinking about the history of this. Let me see here. So when I first started thinking about it, I immediately thought of Gothic houses and dungeons and imprisonment. I thought of entrapment in houses like Shirley Jackson, and I thought a lot about Poe. I think if you're looking at like early examples of this, Poe might be a very good example. But that was just some of the places that my mind went when I first started thinking about this. I have to say, I feel like I'm not as knowledgeable about the trapped motif perhaps like in the contemporary time, because I think it's become more like being trapped somewhere and someone forcing you to hurt yourself or others, or have to undergo some violence in order to get out, and that hasn't ever really been my jam, I guess. So like while I'm aware of that aspect, that turn that Trapped took, I guess I'm not as familiar with it. But we have a whole list of stuff we threw in here. When I was going through it, I was like, oh yeah, that is entrapment. That works. So yeah, I think there's many different ways you can take this theme, and many different ways that people have taken this theme. I feel like this is going to be one of our series where I just start seeing it everywhere. Like if you think about a red car, then you see red cars everywhere. It's going to be brought to my attention in a way that it wasn't before. Lisa, Matt, Lisa, I guess I'll just throw it to you because it was your idea to do this theme. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, and I'll give a little bit of background because Mel, you did mention the like current fad or phenomenon of the escape room. I love escape rooms. I think they're so much fun. I love to see like the theming that people put into it and the storyline that goes like behind the thing. Plus, I'm a puzzle person. That's what I enjoy. Like I enjoy solving puzzles. So I don't know. Escape rooms seem like they're a natural fit for me. So not too long ago, I decided to take my kids to an escape room because I was like, oh, maybe they'll have a good time. And when I tell you that my youngest, like his face went pale when he realized what was happening. I mean, just absolutely all the color drained out of it. I felt so bad. It was one of those moments, just kind of as a mom, that I felt like incredibly terrible. Like I had made a bad judgment decision because I was not expecting him to react that way. But I remember he looked at me and he said, "They're just going to lock us in here." Like the thought absolutely panicked him. And I was like, well, yeah, but I was like trying to explain it to him. I said, well, they have like, if you need to get out, there's a button you can push and you can get out. But I said, once the time is up, which was like, I don't know, an hour or something, you know, they're going to let us out anyway, even if we don't solve the puzzle. But chances are we're going to solve the puzzle and we're going to get out before the hour. And he even just like saying all that did not comfort him at all. Like he was absolutely panicked. And that was one of those things that I was just kind of rolling around in my head because I thought, why why does that scare us so much, really? And I wanted to explore it. So that's kind of my own personal like why this for our first series of season 8. But then the more I started thinking about it, entrapment really is such a key part of the horror genre. I mean, I know from the movie standpoint why it's used a whole lot. You can often get away with um, a single setting, sometimes sometimes with entrapped horror, you can really get away with only one or two characters. I'm thinking in particular of, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but Ryan Reynolds made a film back in 2010 called Buried, about a guy who was buried alive, very Poe-esque. It's got a kind of a modern twist to it, but the entire movie was essentially him. He was able to talk to other people because I think he had a cell phone with him. So you had voice actors, but from what I remember, he was the only actor that was really on the screen. And it was all shot within like this basically like this casket that he was buried in, this coffin that he was buried in. So from a like budget standpoint, I could see why people really enjoy making these kind of movies, because you've really cut down on costs with cast, with settings, all that kind of thing. But when you think about what it does, like I think to us as viewers or readers, it's really kind of interesting because my first thing was wanting to talk about like claustrophobia, because I thought that's a very natural fear. And I think that's what my son was experiencing for the first time, maybe ever in his life, when we did this escape room, was this feeling of the walls closing in, of not being able to breathe, of not being able just to have the freedom to walk out when he wanted to. And suddenly having that freedom taken away was very terrifying to him. But I think at the heart of it, it's something more than that. It's really, I think, what we're scared of is that loss of freedom, but also this feeling that help isn't coming. Because in a lot of these entrapment stories, I think that's the fear, is that you're going to get stuck somewhere that help can't reach you. It doesn't have to be a tight place. So it doesn't necessarily have to be claustrophobia, but I think that sense of hopelessness hanging over the story is something that is really key to like trapped horror. So whether you're buried alive, like Poe liked to write about, the feeling of worrying that people are not going to what word am I looking for? Dig you up in time to save you, is a very real fear. So it's got that like hopelessness through it. But this could be applied to so many things. I mean, we've talked about like outer space, we've talked about aquatic horror, like the deepest parts of the ocean. Those are very big spaces. But I think that would qualify as trapped, right? Because you can get to a certain point where you're trapped there. Um, Certainly things like time loop movies. Mel, you mentioned The Endless, which is a really, I think, good one to talk about. But in that particular case, the idea that you might get stuck in this kind of loop that you can't ever get yourself out of. So, any of these things, I think, lead to that. And you're right, it does have a very long history. I was thinking about it. It really does go back all the way to ancient times. I always tell my students, don't say like start at the beginning of the world. Since the dawn of time, we've done this. But in this case, I feel like this is what people have used to add a sense of terror to their stories. Because if you think about like Greek myths of Prometheus, right? Or if you think about the myth of the story of Sisyphus and the punishments that they're given. And again, I want to like highlight the word punishment there, because it is this idea that it's supposed to be so horrible. But of course, with Prometheus, he stole the fire from the gods and gave it to the humans. And as a response to that, they basically bound him to a rock, the gods did, and sent an eagle every day to eat out his liver. And then it would grow back overnight only to be eaten again. So he's in this like cyclical torture. I mean, eventually, I want to say eventually he was freed in one of the myths. I'm really off on, on my myths. But then you've got like Sisyphus constantly having to roll the rock up the hill only to have it fall back down again. And it's that idea again, you kind of have the cyclical, the loop. I think that would build into what would later become time loop stories, and those kind of where you're playing with the slippage of time. But I really think that we've tied that idea of entrapment, whether it's being entrapped to like some sort of torturous situation or a time loop or just in a closed space like an elevator. We've always like tied that to this sense of terror. You mentioned Poe. I'm sure we're going to talk about Poe for a while. But before that, I'm really curious to hear Matt's kind of initial thoughts.
I'm glad you went first because you put your finger on something that I was having a trouble articulating in my own head, which was that not just that isolation, but the sense that of hopelessness, that help is not going to come. I completely agree with you on that, and like I felt like that helplessness and hopelessness was like on the tip of my tongue ever since we started uh, talking about doing this as our next series, but I couldn't find the right way to articulate it. But I think you're spot on there. One of my very first thoughts when you broached this as like our next topic, or I guess the first topic for this season, was that, I mean, technically, I think at least all three of us, but probably a vast majority of our listeners have experienced this in some way. Those of whom were at least aware and old enough to remember 2020. I mean, the quarantine time of COVID was a huge sense. I think that's what gave rise to a lot of different feelings of disenchantment, I guess, in our culture today. But I mean, that was one of my first thoughts, was that I'm an introvert. I'm very much, uh, I work in a fairly extroverted field. I deal with people all day long, and I feel like I'm good at what I do. But at the end of the day, I need to recharge. I don't go out a lot. I'm basically middle aged now and set in my ways. And it's like, we don't go out and party. We may go out to dinner once a month or something. But I mean, the end of the day, even on the weekend, my idea of a good time is just staying close to the house, maybe having some friends over, maybe going over to some friends' houses, but keeping it small, keeping it light. That said, when COVID quarantine happened, I was going stir crazy. And it was that feeling that I like staying home all the time. I went, my job became a remote position at that point, at least for the duration. And, but it was that loss of control and somebody exterior saying, no, you can't leave. Or, I mean, obviously, we left the house. We did go grocery shopping, things of that nature. But at the bottom of it all, too, though, I think a lot of that feeling was not just the fact that I was being told I can't go out, I can't leave, I can't congregate in public. There was that sense of hopelessness too, or helplessness, sorry, helplessness, HELP, helplessness, because as much as you take like the preventions and preparatory measures and wear a mask and use hand sanitizer and disinfect your groceries when you get home, you're still at the mercy of something microscopic that you can't see. And you have no idea if you've contracted it or not, especially for the first months before a test that was reliable, and especially an over the counter test, was available. Um, so that, I mean, that was immediately where my mind went. And I'm sure we're probably not far enough from it. It's probably still too fresh in people's brains. I'm sure there has been some quarantine horror written since then, but I'm sure in the next few years that's when we're really going to start seeing it as people get a little bit further and it's not so close, um, and it's easier to revisit. I'd like to see the horror that we get coming out of the quarantine. But as you were talking about the helplessness too, I kind of jotted down a quick list of things that popped into my head. I'm just sticking with films here, um, but I think you can make an argument that Knock at the Cabin, which was the film adaptation of Paul Tremblay's Cabin at the End of the World, Misery. Okay, these are fairly standard trapped horror stories. Castaway, I think, could start to fit into that vein. It's not a traditional horror story, but it's not a comfortable movie to watch. Tom Hanks is trapped alone on an island for years at a time. And like you were saying with time loop movies, something like Groundhog Day. Again, it's a comedy. It's a Bill Murray comedy, but I mean, there's a point in the middle of that movie where he's literally just killing himself every day and waking back up the next morning. that's not something that someone who's enjoying reliving the same day would do. I mean, there is a horror aspect even to something like Groundhog Day. So it's a long roundabout way of saying I completely agree. And thank you for actually putting it into word, giving me a way to phrase it, because I felt like for the last couple of weeks that's been on the tip of my tongue. Like, what's the phrase, the word I need? And I think you nailed it.
Well, I'm glad you think so. But truly, I think, and I'm like you, Matt. I think I lean towards the movie side, at least when it comes to trapped horror. There's a lot of them that I really truly love that I hope we discuss when we're doing this series. But even the stories that I've read, I mean, there is just something like this kind of trapped horror, I think, is the bleakest horror that there is. And I'm glad you mentioned like Groundhog Day, which is supposed to be like a romantic comedy, but it does have such like a dark undertone to it. Or even a movie like um Happy Death Day, which is a lot of fun to watch. I will admit that movie is just a joy to watch. It's fun, but that's also like super dark. It's got the same kind of thing where, you know, the girl is living the same day over and over again, and at one point she's just finding fun ways to kill herself because why not? That the fact that that is baked in to those kind of stories, that's like such a common trope in time loop stories, like when people realize they're just going to repeat the same day, so they might as well kill themselves and get the day over with sooner. Like, I mean, that's something that is so bleak. And then, I mean, those are the ones that have some sort of comedy element to it. But then you mention the ones that don't. I mean, they can get dark really fast and just really leave you just kind of bereft. I mean, not feeling any emotion and just, uh, but I feel like before we get into the movies too much, we do have to take a stop. Like, we've talked a little bit about some of the history going back to Gothic times, or ancient times, I should say. It does pop up again in the Gothics, in the ending of the Monk in particular. Well, and a lot in the Monk. I mean, there's imprisonment. There's he gets Ambrosia, the evil monk, at the end. Spoiler alert for a book that's several centuries old, but he ends up getting tied to a cliff and basically being tortured, very much like Prometheus, actually, now that I think about it. But Gothic houses, dungeons, it's all about imprisonment, especially for the woman who finds herself there. It ties itself to domesticity, which can be a trap. Obviously, like Shirley Jackson is going to use this a lot. But I think when you're talking about like written horror and you're talking about the history of this kind of trapped horror, we have to take a stop at Poe. Now, Mel, I know you have a lot of thoughts on Poe and the trapped horror. So I'm really curious to hear what you dug up. Pun definitely intended there.
I don't know how much I dug up, but one of the first things that popped into my head when we first started thinking about this topic was just like when I started noodling around on a piece of paper, I realized that a lot of Poe's narrators are trapped when you think about it. And of course, I mean, there's the most obvious, which is the premature burial story where someone is prematurely buried. And of course, there are stories about people being afraid of that in that time period. And I think there was even at least one original Twilight Zone episode that dealt with that kind of fear. And then, of course, the 2010 movie that you were talking about, I think it's a perennial fear. But I was thinking to myself, like the Pit and the Pendulum, the guy stuck in the dungeon pit. So we talked about the Red Death at one point, and that's being forcibly entrapped in a building to escape a pandemic, which is kind of like what Matt was talking about with like existential dread and feeling helpless that we experienced during quarantine. But then there's narrators that are trapped in their heads. Like, I guess you could talk about like William Wilson, who sees his alter ego, like the good and evil twins almost in a way, but as one person. And then I was thinking of the stories that he has where like message in a bottle where people are trapped, the guy's trapped on a ship that's just going around and around, and he can't control it or go back to where he came from, which that of course made me think of all the ways, like you were saying, Lisa, that space can be scary, being trapped on a spaceship, for instance. I mean, I think this is a perennial fear of being somewhere you don't understand and a vehicle you can't control, or something has happened, and again, helplessness. um but yeah, and then just basically isolation, like all the times he has like the haunted house that's in the middle of nowhere, and the family that's completely shut off, or the woman that's completely shut off, like Berenice or Morella or Ligeia, or the fall of the House of Usher, for instance. um I was racking my mind earlier today thinking about this. If there's a Poe narrator that's not trapped in some way, it seemed like that was something that he was putting his finger on the pulse of people being helpless and hopeless in various situations. And I don't know if it's just that isolation itself is such a handy trick for horror, but he certainly seemed to get the psychological aspects of it in addition to the physical aspects that there could be. Um, Especially when he has his narrators kind of trapped psychologically in some way, and not just in an isolated place somewhere. And I feel like that's probably been a big influence on a lot of the stuff in our list here of isolation horror in particular.
Poe is definitely hard to escape when you're talking about it. And I don't know, I don't want to go too much into like the psychology of why Poe was obsessed with these kind of trap narrators, but uh, it does seem to pop up a lot. But then again, maybe that's just because he had the pulse of what was, he had his finger on the pulse of what was scary. I do want to mention, because I feel like we're going to have to talk. We talked about him a little bit, but in our kind of look at the history of the written side of this before we get to the movies, and that's Stephen King, who I think is, if we're looking at the history, there's probably two big writers that built up this subgenre of trapped horror. And the first, of course, is Edgar Allan Poe. The second one is Stephen King. And I do find this funny. I always look for a reason to talk about this story because it's such a very like weird and gross story. But he wrote this story in 2008 called A Very Tight Place. I'm not sure if we have ever talked about it on the podcast. Maybe we have when we talked about Poe. But this first appeared in McSweeney's, and then the same year it was collected in his collection Just After Sunset. But I'm pretty sure he wasn't even just like inspired by Poe. He was completely like ripping off the Cask of Amontillado, um, in which I can never remember Fortunato, and I can't remember the other character's name off the top of my head. It's been a long day, but
Montresor.
Montresor, thank you. Is, and you have the kind of rivalry between the two, and the dude bricked up inside the wall while he's drunk from the festivities looking for more wine. This is, and it's a revenge story, right? At its core, it's a revenge story. But it's not, yes, it's a trap story because it's essentially a burial alive. It's just that in this case, the victim is too drunk to really realize what's happening. And it's all from the point of view of the perpetrator, right? What's really interesting is King kind of spins that on its head in A Very Tight Place. And what you have is two characters who, and again, I don't remember the details. I highly recommend just reading the story, but it's two characters who have, bad blood between them, and one of them decides to enact revenge on the other. and so convinces him to come out to this. Basically, it's like a construction site at night, and he convinces him to get into this porta potty, and then basically makes it so that he can't get out, like he's locked in this porta potty. And it's completely sinister. Like he his whole plan, if I remember right, is to have him be buried alive in this porta potty. um but it's from the point of view of the guy stuck in the porta potty, so you really get a lot of that kind of trapped feeling. There's obviously claustrophobia. At one point, spoiler alert, at one point it falls over and everything that would be in a porta potty comes out. So that's like the kind of gross aspect to it. Totally fun to read. But it's a really fun read if you like that particular Poe story and kind of know the tradition that he's pulling on. But I bring all of this up. Number one, I hope that more people will go and seek out A Very Tight Place and read it, because I just think it's a fun story. But I think Stephen King has kind of taken the title from Poe as kind of the I don't know what is, I don't know why I'm punny tonight, but he is kind of the king of he's the king of trapped horror that we know. Matt, you mentioned a few of them. Would you like to, I guess, elaborate on some of King's trapped stories and what we can learn from them?
Well, I'm not sure what we can learn from them other than that it's truly, truly horrible. But no, I think you're right that if we're going to declare a successor to Poe, it would probably be King. I know in my little like back of the envelope sort of list that I started jotting down in the middle of you talking earlier, Misery was one of the ones that came up. But I mean, there are so many different kinds of stories that he's written. But I mean, obviously, The Shining, the the distance from help and from uh, any sort of other part of civilization is a big part of it. I mean, obviously, the haunted hotel is terrifying, but the fact that there is no help coming and there is nowhere uh, for Wendy and Danny to go to is another part of it. Then, I mean, of course, you've got Cujo, like Mel mentioned earlier, of being trapped in a car. Something that we actually, we discussed Cujo in a previous episode, even with we. I don't think the trapped wasn't the reason that we picked it at that point. It was more of the killer animals, but I know we talked about that being an aspect of the horror. Um, like I said, Misery. Gerald's Game is another one where I mean you have a woman chained to a bed, well, I guess handcuffed technically, who's accidentally killed her husband, and again, remote location, far from any way to get any sort of help. And of course, this was written in a time well before cell phones even existed, so um, yeah, no easy way for her to call for help, even if she were to get herself loose. I do believe I haven't read Gerald's Game. Well, I haven't finished it. I read about half of it and just I couldn't finish it. But that's another story. um, I'm trying to think if there's any. I'm sure that there are others, and probably definitely other short stories that he's explored it in. I know the one that you just mentioned even is one that I'm not aware of. Haven't read it. Hadn't even really heard of it. I think I mean, the title sounds familiar, but I had not read the story. And when you were kind of giving an overview of it, it did not ring a bell at all. So I must have only just heard the title in passing or something. But um, yeah, it seems to be a recurring element in his horror that he does like to use this level of isolation and lack of um, access to an escape or help. I guess Dreamcatcher might count, but I don't know if we would actually want to count it because it's so terrible, but I think that would kind of fall in there as well. Um, but yeah, as far as what we can learn from them, again, I don't know that there is a good lesson to learn, except that it is a very fertile ground for good horror, because all of those just within Stephen King's body of work are very different works from each other. I think Misery and Gerald's Game have a lot in common in terms of like thematic elements, but to compare Misery or Gerald's Game to The Shining, those are very different, and yet at the heart they have that same kernel of inspiration, which I think the more that we're talking about it in this episode and the more I think about it as I've been trying to get ready for recording this episode, the more I've thought that something that was a narrow topic but fun and worth exploring is actually much 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 broader than I was giving it credit for.
Yeah, I totally agree, Matt. I just want to jump in. I don't think this helps uncomplicate our figuring out what King means by this, but I read Dolores Claiborne last year, and that's more like a murder mystery of his. But yet, it all happens on this tiny island. So you have like small town, tiny island geographical separation, plus a woman who feels trapped in a marriage. Plus, I think it's not a spoiler because it's on the cover. There's a well. So, I mean, there's like multiple aspects of isolation and entrapment there. I think it's probably like all over his work. But like I said, I don't know. I think that just makes it more ubiquitous, like you were saying. I don't know that that says this is what he's actually doing with it, except that entrapment in all these different ways is like a really, I don't know, like a threatening existential thing. And it makes it worse that we can feel entrapped in all these different ways too, I'm assuming. Lisa, I know you wanted to jump in.
I just think that, I mean, you brought up a really excellent point with Dolores Claiborne, which is also in, something like Gerald's Game. But this idea that you can be trapped in multiple ways. So, one we haven't even mentioned was 1408, the hotel room one, which, yeah, it was 1408. Um, but there, in that case too, you have what one thing that I think we can learn, at least just from a genre point of view, that King does, is that he will take, and I mean, this probably owes back to Poe a little bit too, but that he can take this idea of entrapment in the physical sense. So whether you're entrapped by a place, being held by a madman or a madwoman in the case of Annie Wilkes, trapped by nature, like The Shining, snow stopping people from being able to come in, by the supernatural. So if it's a haunted house or a haunted hotel or something like The Mist, where you have, not only like an island situation, but you have monsters that are out to get you, that are trapping you. I think that is, it shines, this kind of horror shines when there is some sort of psychological entrapment that's going on as well. So I think that that's something really important to point out, that, if it's trapped in a bad marriage, which certainly fits for something like Gerald's Game, um, it fits with The Shining too. I mean, that even before the supernatural stuff in the book, there's been a clear case of domestic violence. So that is its own kind of entrapment, that's going on there. In something like 1408, you've got somebody who's dealing with grief and is entrapped by that. I think all of this works really well, when we think about some of the more modern stories that are using domesticity as a trap, for instance. Um, but I'm thinking in particular of a few things that have stood out to me over the past few years. One of those is the movie Vivarium, which plays on several of these kind of motifs and tropes that you get in entrapment. So it's, in a way, it's a time loop because it exists kind of outside of normal time. But this couple is looking for a house and finds themselves looking at this like very cookie cutter type neighborhood with all the houses look the same, and they find that they can't leave because they're getting lost and turned around in the neighborhood, and so they just kind of keep coming back. But then they find themselves with this like weird child that has come to live with them. And that's really all I'll say. If you haven't watched Vivarium, I highly recommend it. But it plays up so well this idea of not just like a physical entrapment, but also like domesticity as a trap. So it's the marriage that's the trap. It's the suburbs that's the trap. It's parenthood that's a trap. And I think in a lot of ways, kind of we've seen that shift from like just the domestic realm to now that we're in the stage of capitalism that we're in our culture, but like office work, and just capitalism in general as a trap. So I'm thinking, I mean, there was the movie The Belko Experiment, which was all right. I mean, it was fun. It's basically people are in this very mysterious, they work for this kind of very mysterious company, and it's this weird office culture, and then they all kind of have to kill each other. It's like the Hunger Games, but set in an office is the best way I can describe it. I mean, it's fine. But the Apple TV show Severance, I think, is a really great example of being trapped. Because talk about like how they're playing with our idea of like work-life balance and the ways we can get tied to our jobs, and the ways we try to avoid that. That's something that I'm really interested in seeing how that develops, because I don't think we've had we've had domesticity in the past, but we haven't had a whole lot of this kind of office culture.
I too want to see where the office culture goes, and not just because I um, work in an office job. And as Mel and Lisa know from our discussions outside of the podcast, I actually just recently left a rather awful one in favor of one that is much better. Um, but I mean, you mentioned Severance, and I think that is an excellent example. And for those of you listeners who haven't watched it, please go watch it. It's an incredibly great show. But I also think of and I don't know if either of you have seen this movie, but the movie Wanted. The movie itself overall does not fit into this, but the opening part of it does, and it's one that always strikes me, just because of how real it is. But the main character, it's kind of a montage of him going to work every day in this cubicle, boring office drone job, while the song by Nine Inch Nails, "Every Day Is Exactly the Same," is playing. And I swear I've had like moments where I'm like, this is the most realistic thing I've ever seen. Especially in a movie that ends up with people curving bullets and stuff that's absolutely silly. But uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know that we've seen it play out as much as there is room for, but I definitely hope that more artists delve into this, because I mean, Severance is a fantastic example, and hopefully we'll get some more people mining this vein.
Yeah, I just want to say first, I need to get Apple TV so I can watch all these shows that people tell me about. I haven't gotten it, but no, I think what you guys are saying makes perfect sense. Like, I especially caught, Lisa, when you're talking about the people getting trapped in suburbia. I mean, these ideas of routine and being trapped in lives that we don't want to be trapped in are such a part. They've been a part of our lives for years and years and years. But I feel like you both are right that it's kind of coming to the fore now. It reminded me a little bit of Shirley Jackson stories about suburbs that all look so much the same that people can go home to different houses and it doesn't even matter. It's just like you're just stuck in this cookie cutter kind of way of being. Okay, well, I know that we still had stuff in our doc that we could talk about, but this is going to be a series for probably, say, 3 or 4 episodes or so. So I'm sure we'll get into the nitty gritty of this theme more and more. And listeners, I have to say, if you're anything like me, you're going to start seeing this all over the place. So I think we'll end it there. We hope that you're excited about our new theme. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we are doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have mini episodes over there that we've taken a pause on creating new ones, but there's still a huge backlist of stuff you can listen to. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.